Okay, welcome. Let's go ahead and get started here. So a couple of announcements. First of all, the next assignment that you've got to do on Thursday, and then the one after that is Tuesday. So we kind of have a lot of stuff going on back to back. But then after a week from today, when you're finished with the exam, then it'll be kind of a little bit more relaxed schedule again. So what we're going to be starting on today is some ideas that are presented in Chapter 5. Hopefully each of you is taking the time to use the textbook as an important learning resource. Reading through those book chapters is a great way to better understand the concepts from another point of view. The whole point of this course is to give you tools to do decision making. And this is where, here in Chapter 5, it becomes very obvious that that's our goal, is for you to have the ability to choose from among alternatives. So are there any questions related to the announcements before we get started? All right. By the way, here's the quiz from last time. I'm going to pass that around for you to fish yours out of the stack. So what we're going to be talking about today is 3 different approaches to making decisions when you're comparing alternatives. Now, a little bit more information about the exam before we get into that. It's going to be here in this room. The question types, you may expect to have some concept questions that are like a short answer kind of a thing, maybe defining terms or explaining something. So it's not just enough to be able to plug numbers into an equation. Engineering is more than that. It's also understanding and being able to articulate what you know. So there will be some concept questions, and then there will also be problem solving, and I'll provide the equations that you'll need for the problem solving. I'll provide whatever table lookup factors are required. You will not need to bring your computer for this exam, but for the next exam you will. So there aren't any Excel questions. We haven't really done enough Excel to this point to include some of those type questions. And the exam duration, 75 minutes. We have actually a little bit more time than most often when I teach this class. It's a 3-day week, so it's only 50, but this time we're going to have 75. So that just gives you a little bit less pressure to complete the exam. Any questions about this test? So a week from today you'll be starting on it, and you'll just be laughing inside how easy it is, because you're completely prepared. All right. Don't stay up late studying. Just make it consistent, and then that's so much less stress. All right. This figure comes from your book, and it's a little bit complicated, but the point that it's making overall is the idea of decision making. And so let's look at the details here. What this is talking about is in the decision making process, what sorts of factors lead to proposals. So if you're in a company, it may be just stray ideas. It sometimes can be a mandate, which means, like instructions from above. The head chief of the organization is decreeing something. Sometimes proposal arise because of a plan. Maybe a previous project triggered an idea. So there are a series of proposals, and in the first screening phase, at the very beginning, you separate them between the not viable proposals and those that are viable. And ordinarily, that first screening process, if the future revenue is less than the present cost, even in absolute terms, then it would be rejected. Because we know, for example, that future dollars to begin with are less valuable than present dollars. And so if you add up all of the future dollars and it's $1 million of revenue, but it's a $2 million project, then that can be considered not viable. So that's the first level of screening. Other factors that maybe would help you to distinguish between not viable and viable is it could be simply that you don't have the personnel resources, the space isn't available, and they can't be obtained no matter what the cost. All right, so if you have a viable proposal, now all those different ideas can be broken up into 2 different problem types. Sometimes you have situations where you can do more than a single project. And so if you think about a company like Google, at any given time, they're working on dozens of different projects. They may be working on a new cell phone. They may be working on an ad revenue project. They may be working on maps. telecommunications with Google Voice. They have their own broadband services in a lot of cities. And so those would all be examples of independent projects. But a mutually exclusive alternative may be a company that is considering a new cement mixing machine. And they only need one cement mixer. And so you can't buy two different models when only one piece of equipment is required. And so that's an illustration of the situation where the alternatives are mutually exclusive. Now, you'll notice that here under independent project it says select all that are justified, whereas in a mutually exclusive alternative you're just selecting one project. The last element of this decision-making system is that in some cases there are like public projects and governmental type projects where you're going to have only costs and the project itself doesn't generate revenue. So like a public park is an example of that. People don't pay money, admission money, to go to the park. It's just, it experiences costs, but there aren't any direct revenues. In contrast to that, when you're in the business of selling products, you'll have both revenues and costs. So what you'll do is you'll need some sort of an evaluation technique to allow you to make the selection. So that's what we're going to do today, is introduce the first of the ideas that allows you to perform an evaluation and make a selection. So all of this is just kind of the initial screening and initial sorting. But once that's done, what is the method used to do the evaluation? So let's just emphasize some of this key terminology because we're going to continue to use this through the rest of the semester. And remember, you've got an exam a week from today, and you need to be able to explain certain big ideas. So a mutually exclusive project or a mutually exclusive alternative is when you can only choose one proposal, either because that's limited funding is available, or you only need one item to satisfy the objective. In contrast to that, independent projects, it's the opposite of mutually exclusive. In an independent project, you can select as many as are justified. One of the options that's always available that you always need to consider is the do-nothing alternative. And this is a big mistake that lots of organizations make, including universities. A lot of times, it's just assumed that you have to do some new thing. It's assumed that you have to produce a new product or begin a new academic program or make a new development. But the do-nothing alternative should always be considered. And in a lot of cases, when all the other options are bad and are going to cause an organization to lose money, then do-nothing needs to be seriously considered. So in the do-nothing approach, the costs that you currently have aren't adjusted. And then just to differentiate between revenue and cost-based projects, in a revenue-based project, that's typical of private companies and a few government projects. And so the West Virginia Turnpike is a rare example of a government project that generates revenue. And so if you drive on that road, you have to pay a fee. And there are just a handful of government-operated projects like that that actually does turn a revenue. Some other examples of revenue-based projects that are government-operated would maybe be water distribution, wastewater collection and treatment, whereas cost-based projects only have outflows and no inflows because all of the alternatives in a cost-based project have the same revenue, which is either none or maybe just the baseline taxes that people are paying. All right, so we'll continue to flush out some of these ideas in the context of the analysis we're going to be performing over the coming days and weeks. In each time that I introduced a new way of comparing alternatives, I'll tell you what's the decision criteria. And this is a really important point. When you're working on a homework problem or when you are completing a quiz or exam question, you always need to be sure that you identify what was the basis for your decision. Like, why was option A better than option B? You need to be able to say, not only here's the analysis that I did, but this is how I decided whether A or B was better. Now, in the case of present worth, there are a couple of different factors that we use for making a decision. Now remember MARR. Does somebody remember what that acronym stands for? MARR? Good, that's right. So minimum acceptable rate of return. And so that's the interest rate that a lot of factors goes into your organization's identifying that. It can be the interest rates that are being charged. It can be administrative costs. It can be mandate from administration. There can be a lot of different factors that goes into the minimum accepted rate of return. But here's what we do in present worth. You discount all of the cash flow to the present. So all of the future revenues, whether they're recurring annual revenues, whether they're just one-off future revenues or costs, all of the cash flow take to year zero, to the present. That's why this is called present worth analysis. Take everything to the present. Now, if the projects are mutually exclusive, meaning you can only choose one, then you'd pick the one with the largest positive present worth. If they're independent, meaning you can select more than one, choose everything that has a present worth greater than or equal to 0 when you use the MAR to discount. So what if you have a negative present worth? Well, if you have a negative present worth, then you'd select none of them unless the problem statement says you have to choose something. And then you choose whatever has the least negative present worth. So you try and minimize the damage if you're forced into an option. So a car is an example of an alternative where most people don't make money with their car, not directly. It's just you're losing money by owning the thing. You're having to pay your insurance, you're having to pay for tires, you're having to pay the payment itself and fuel. And so in that case, you're just trying to look for the transportation that's acceptable to you that minimizes costs. But in most of the examples we'll work, you are going to have a positive present worth, and so you have to understand whether it's independent or mutually exclusive. So decision criteria. I can't tell you the number of times on exams I have to take away points because it wasn't clear what decision criteria students were making when they chose from among the alternatives. If I give you option A, B, and C, not only do you have to tell me which one is best, if there's 3 options, you have a 1 in 3 chance of guessing it right. So I'm not just asking for you to guess which one is right, but show the evidence and also explain the decision criteria. All right. So here's an example that we're going to work through today to get the first feel on how to compare alternatives. Now, it's not really any kind of a new idea in terms of the analysis because you've discounted cash flows to the present before. You've done it on lots of occasions. You've used the factor tables or you've used the equations to find out all of these values over time, what are they worth at year 0? And that's what you're going to do here. The first step I'm going to ask you to do is to draw a cash flow diagram. And even if the problem doesn't specifically require it, it's such a great idea to draw a cash flow diagram because it helps you avoid mistakes. Even if you know how to do something, mistakes can sink you. Like if you know the main idea and you just make some little mistakes on the test, it can take you from an A to a C easily. So you got to find those ways. How do you avoid mistakes? Well, double checking your calculations is one. The other way to avoid mistakes is draw a cash flow diagram to make sure that actually you see what's going on. So part 1, draw a cash flow diagram, and then part 2, use present worth analysis to select which is better, Mitsubishi or Hyundai. And what we can see is they have different costs, different annual maintenance charges. One of them is more expensive than the other. Fuel costs are different. The revenue are slightly different, and so is the salvage value. So take all of those cash flows to year 0 once you've drawn the cash flow diagram. The 10% table is on the back side of the paper. So you can use the factors to find out the present worth of each and then identify which is best and state directly what is the decision criteria. So the first step is to translate the given cash flow statements into a diagram. And so we're comparing the Mitsubishi to the Hyundai. And it looks like the Mitsubishi has a greater first cost. Sometimes we call that present amount that you have to pay to acquire the item. We call that the first cost. And then if we look at the fuel cost, it's lower on the Mitsubishi. And it also has lower annual maintenance costs. And then it also generates more revenue. Somehow that equipment seems to be more efficient. And then because it was more expensive in the beginning, it seems there's a higher salvage value at the end of life. So basically this analysis is asking, is it worth paying the extra amount for the Mitsubishi? It's more expensive up front, but then you save money in the long run. So is it better to go that route? So here are the two cash flow diagrams. And on the whiteboard, you can see what happens when we basically combine the annual series together and just find like the net annual series. Now, I noticed at least one of you combined the final future value with the annual series, and that's okay to do that. So if you want your annual series to be n equals 7, and then you have this single amount in year 8, that's one approach, and that's fine. The solution I'm going to show you, I kept the annual series separate from this single future value. Okay, so we're comparing Mitsubishi and Hyundai, and there are three components to the present value. There's the initial purchase price for each of them. So this negative $250,000 for the Mitsubishi, the negative $205,000 for the Hyundai. So that's the initial first cost. And then we want to find the present value of the recurring revenue. So $43,000 versus $32,000. And both of them are going to have the same factor because it's the same find present given annual, P/A. It's for 10%. It's for n equals 8. So once I look up that factor of 5.3349 from the 10% table on the back page, I can use that factor for both the Mitsubishi and for the Hyundai. It's just the magnitude of the annual series that's different. And then the third component of taking this cash flow diagram, all of it to the present, is that single amount. The $55,000 in the Mitsubishi versus the $44,000 in the case of the Hyundai. So I discount that to year 0, doing P/F. There's just one of them, so it's not an annual series, it's a future amount. And I use n equals 8. In this case, n equals 8 doesn't mean there's 8 of them. N equals 8 means that you have to go back 8 years to get it from where it is to the present. So if we have it here, we have to jump backwards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 periods. Never be ashamed to actually count on the cash flow diagram to get the right row, to get the right n. And that's another reason why I think it's useful to set up cash flow diagrams, is then it allows you to count and make sure that you have the right n value for your factors. So in the end, the reason why we select Mitsubishi as the best alternative is we go back to our criteria. So the criteria is choose the alternative with the highest positive present worth. Well, we could immediately reject the Hyundai because what the Hyundai alternative tells us is actually you're not even breaking even with the Hyundai. And so the Mitsubishi is the best alternative because it has the highest positive present worth. And how did we know this was a mutually exclusive analysis rather than independent projects? Well, in the problem statement it said a new excavator. So that tells you you're just selecting one. It's mutually exclusive. So choose one alternative. Any questions about this first problem? All right. Let's do a little bit more lecture stuff, and then I'm going to turn you loose on the rest of the in-class exercise. I can come back to this if you didn't get a chance to write everything down, but I'll need to do that later. What if your two options don't last the same amount of time? Okay, so look at these two cash flow diagrams. Option A versus option B. So option B is more expensive, but it lasts longer. Now, option A only lasts for 6 years, but option B lasts for 9 years. So which one is better? Well, we can't directly compare things that have a different useful life. We can't simply do the same thing we just did. In this first example, we could compare them after taking everything to the present because they both had 8-year time horizons. You know, the last year was 8 for both options. But in this case, the rule is you can't compare them if they don't last the same amount of time. So we have to do something so that they line up the same number of years. The first way to do that, the first tool we're going to talk about, is called the LCM approach, and it's called least common multiple. So look what we've done so that they have the same amount of years, so that they both last the same duration. This was our base alternative. Option A was 6 years. Option B was 9 years. What we do is we repeat them until they terminate in the same year. So you can look just by inspection. You're going to have to do 3 cycles of option A and 2 cycles of option B. So let me toggle between them. Oops. Okay, option A and option B both repeated. Now this is another one where I can predict with 100% certainty what the most common student errors are going to be, because I see the same thing semester after semester. The biggest mistakes, there's 2 of them, that people make when they're applying this, is that sometimes they put a gap year between the cycles. And so what you'll notice in cycle 2 of option A, you have to buy the thing again the same year that you still have a revenue. So at the 6, this arrow right here, which is the revenue for the 6th year, you get that revenue for having conducted the activity during the 6th year. So you get the revenue at the end of the 6th year, and then at the beginning of the 7th year, you have to buy the equipment again. So the mistake that sometimes people make is they'll buy the item in year 7 instead of buying it in year 6. So if you buy it in year 7, then you wouldn't get revenue until year 8. And we don't want there to be any gaps in revenue. So you have to buy the item at the same time, you know, like the time point in time where you'd be receiving your last revenue from the previous cycle. So that's one of the most common errors that people make. And then the other common error is that then they'll buy the item again in the 18th year. But you don't need to buy it again if the analysis period is finished. Because if you buy it one last time, then you'd have perfectly new equipment, but the comparison is over. So avoid those 2 mistakes. Don't put in the gap year, and don't buy the item in the final year. So least common multiple. Why do you think it's called that? Least common multiple. Right, yeah. You know, we could have repeated this more than 18 years total, but we wanted to have the cash flow diagram be the shortest years possible where they both terminate at the same time. Okay, so one of the inherent assumptions of the least common multiple approach is it assumes that it's possible to repeat the cash flow diagrams. For instance, it assumes that you can buy the item in the future for the same price that you bought it today. If you look at what we did, we said that in year 0, you could buy the item for $11,500, and then we said you can also buy the item for $11,500 in year 6 and in year 12. So maybe that's possible, maybe it's not. You know, there are some things where, you know, a $1,000 computer, if you spend $1,000 for a computer in the future, probably you'll get a pretty good computer just like you can today. But more generally, prices are increasing over time. So in this comparison, you may have to make manual adjustments when you apply this in the real world. You know, if you're repeating your cash flow diagrams, you may assume a slightly higher price in the future to account for inflation. But built in, if you're doing this to make it terminate in the same number of years, just by definition, you're assuming that the cash flow diagram can be repeated. So if the item can't be purchased for the same price in the future, you could just make an adjustment on what you expect the purchase price to be. The other thing to do kind of a reality check on is whether the revenues are going to be the same in the second cycle that they were in the first. You know, maybe you're able to collect more revenue in the future as prices in the market go up. All right, so that was the first tool. Like if you have a different number of years and you want to make them the same, you can do repeatability. The next way of handling that is called contract services. Okay, so look at the cash flow diagrams. This is the same option A and the same option B as before, where remember option A lasted for 6 initially. Option B is that 9-year alternative. So what do you notice in the contract services approach? What is going on with option A? Okay, we've got an outflow as well as the inflow. So it's called contract services. Anyone want to take a stab at what's going on? Like the company is doing what for the final 3 years? Exactly. Yeah, so rather than buy the item again, what they're doing is assuming that you can go out and pay some recurring fee to rent the equipment or to get a contractor to do a certain task for you, and then you get the same revenue as before. And what we've done is we've made the cash flow diagrams end at the same time. So it goes 9 years. And so we had one that was too short. Option A was too short. So contract services allows you to lengthen the cash flow diagram so that now they're both the same length. Okay, so remember, option 1 was repeat them. The least common multiple approach just means just repeat it until they end at the same number of years. The second technique, contract services, make the short cash flow diagram longer. And the last one, early termination, says, let's make the alternative that was too long, let's shorten it. And the way that you shorten it is rather than operating it for the final years of its life, of its useful life, just sell the item on the market. You know, you can assume or calculate a single amount in the final year that you would expect to get instead of operating the equipment for its final lifetime. So the one that was too long, we shortened in this alternative compared to the one immediately previous, we lengthened the one that was too short. Sell the equipment, forego the future revenues. All right, so on the back side of the in-class exercise, on the second page, use the least common multiple approach to determine which alternative is better. So what I ask you to do is draw the cash flow diagrams to repeat the cycles, and then find the present worth of both option A and of option B. And you'll notice that this is at 4%. The 4% table is on the last page. So here's the cash flow diagram, what it should look like. As I was walking around, nobody made that mistake. It's the first semester. Nobody's made the mistake of adding the extra gap year or buying the item at the end. So I hope it stays that way. I would be delighted if there were no recurrences of that mistake on the exam. All right, so here's option A versus option B. Boy, that's kind of messy. That's not my best work. So let's just make sure we're all on the same page, talk through the second and the third solution. Okay, so here's our cash flow diagram once we repeat. So this is invoking the repeatability assumption of LCM, and we need to move everything to year 0. So we've got 3 things. We've got the annual series, a single future value in year 6, and a single future value in year 12, and then here we've got the annual series, the single future value in year 9, and then when we do move it to year 0, then there's already some amount in year 0 we have to combine it all with. So that's here what we were doing where we had the original 11,500, which was an outflow. It's important to keep track of the minus signs. And then we discounted the annual series to year 0 with the P/A function. And then we moved those individual amounts from year 6 and from year 12. So that's how we got 35,525 for option A, which is the better alternative that we should select when compared to option B. All right, now the last one, contract services. What makes this a bit tricky, option B is pretty easy. I didn't see really anybody making mistakes with option B. But option A is a little bit tricky because we've got an annual series that we're going to be moving to year 6. So we've got this inflow annual series where it is 9 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, that's easy to take to year 0. What sometimes throws people off is this one where we've got year 7, 8, and 9. So what you're going to do is first you have to take it to year 6, and then you go from year 6 to year 0. Okay, so here what I've said is we've got the P/A with 9 years. Up here above the line is for our inflows or our revenues. So $5,000 times that factor. And then below the line we've got our outflows, and so there's the P/A with 3 years times the 4,000, but then we have to move that from year 6 to year 0. So then there's also going to be a P/F factor that we multiply everything by. So in the end, that option A is worth $16,903 compared to option B. Let's scroll down to see option B. $14,285. All right. So if you feel comfortable that you got it, you're free to leave. If you've got questions, I'll stick around for the next few minutes and help people find any errors they might have.